Hi everyone, my name's Ali and today I'm going to be talking about human trafficking within Canada. According to Canada's Department of Justice, human trafficking involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, and/or exercising control, direction, or influence over the movements of a person in order to exploit that person, typically through sexual exploitation or forced labor. It is often described as a form of modern slavery. Sex trafficking involves recruiting, transporting, or holding victims for sexual exploitation. In Canada, the people who are the most at risk of becoming victims of sex trafficking are women and young girls, youth and young adults, and Indigenous peoples, in particular Indigenous women and girls. Labor trafficking involves recruiting, transporting, or holding victims to coerce them into doing any kind of work. The people who are the most at risk of becoming victims of labor trafficking in Canada are migrant workers due to language barriers, working in isolated or remote areas, and lacking access to services, support, and correct information about their legal rights. Because human trafficking is such an underground crime, it is difficult to obtain hard numbers and stats about how much trafficking is ongoing within the country, and the stats we do have on human trafficking are typically only about reported occurrences. Because of this, it is extremely difficult to reach victims once they have been trafficked. This is why prevention is the key to addressing human trafficking. Although human trafficking is still a huge issue in Canada, our government has put forward a number of different initiatives to not only prevent human trafficking, but also to protect victims who have been trafficked. In 2012, the Government of Canada launched the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking, which consolidated all federal activities into one comprehensive plan. The Government of Canada invested $14.5 million over 5 years to put in place the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, the first of its kind in Canada, to help victims and survivors of human trafficking easily access the services they need. Canada has also continued efforts to coordinate the law enforcement response to human trafficking through the RCMP's Human Trafficking National Coordination Centre, which is a focal point for policing efforts to combat and disrupt individuals and criminal organizations involved in human trafficking activities. Beginning in 2018 to 2019, Canada invested $3.4 million over 2 years to establish a migrant worker support network for temporary foreign workers dealing with potential mistreatment or abuse. And finally, since the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking expired in 2016, the Canadian government has since implemented the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking for 2019 to 2024. This plan builds upon and complements the efforts of Canada's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence and advocates the implementation of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. It involves a whole-of-government approach that brings together federal efforts and is supported by an investment of $57.2 million over 5 years. My first solution for prevention is to mandate human trafficking education within school curriculums. Currently, not a single province in Canada mandates teaching students about human trafficking, even though schools are prime targets for perpetrators, and no province guarantees through education legislation that this topic is covered. Ontario is the only province that includes the words sex trafficking in its curriculums, but teachers are able to opt out of using this term and opt out of teaching the topic entirely. It is important that the words human trafficking and sex trafficking are used within school curriculums so that students can properly identify perpetrators and the tactics they may use. Overall, provinces need to implement curriculums where students learn about human trafficking while also discussing healthy relationships, consent, violent behavior, sexual exploitation, and digital technology, as well as causes such as gender inequity and poverty. Education on these topics will help prevent students from becoming victims of trafficking while giving them the knowledge and ability to identify recruitment techniques when they see them. There are, of course, a number of challenges to this solution. The first challenge is funding. The Government of Canada needs to provide more funding that can be used to create human trafficking education within school curriculums. There is also a need for funding for the training of teachers and social workers so that they are knowledgeable enough to discuss the issue of human trafficking in age-appropriate ways for students in every grade. Another challenge is standardizing human trafficking education throughout the country. Since education is a provincial matter, it is not guaranteed that all human trafficking education would be equal and of the same quality among the provinces and territories. The next solution for the prevention of human trafficking is a focus on Indigenous communities. As I mentioned earlier, Indigenous women and girls are at a higher risk of becoming victims of human trafficking. Some of the recurring themes that contribute to the recruitment of Indigenous girls and women into human trafficking include precarious housing and poor living conditions, high rates of unemployment, unstable unemployment, and low working wages, lack of access to social and economic resources and programs, prior exposure to human trafficking and the sex trade from a young age through family or friends, and family violence and the impacts of colonization, such as the residential school experience and intergenerational trauma. In June of 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released its final report called Reclaiming Power and Place. This report includes calls for justice related to sexual exploitation and human trafficking, such as support for Indigenous-led prevention and community awareness initiatives, training for transportation and hospitality service providers to help identify, and funding and support programs for Inuit children and youth to teach them how to respond to threats and identify exploitation. Further solutions that focus on Indigenous communities have been proposed by the Native Women's Association of Canada, including that more funding be allocated to culturally safe, community-based programs addressing poverty, precarious housing, healthy relationships, and internet safety. That more funding be allocated to accessible, stable, and culturally appropriate safe homes for victims of human trafficking. That laws and education materials be translated to a wide range of Indigenous languages to enhance accessibility and address any gaps in communication and knowledge transfer. And that, in collaboration with Indigenous organizations, communities, and leadership, resources be developed and provided to communities on safe travel and legitimate work opportunities. And similarly to the last solution, the challenge to the solution of focusing on Indigenous communities is the funding needed to implement these measures. Overall, human trafficking is an extreme violation of human rights that needs to be continually addressed here in Canada. While I discussed two main solutions for this issue, there are still a number of other approaches that could be discussed, such as harsher punishments for perpetrators, more funding for services for victims all over the country, and a focus on mental health as a means of prevention for victims. So thank you all for watching, and I hope this discussion has made you think more about the issue of human trafficking within Canada.